Hi, everyone. And I'm going to be talking today about deploying Python web apps to Azure and doing it in the easiest way possible that I have discovered. And I'm calling it one click. It's actually one command, but if we can think of one command as one click, then, I think it works. So first about me, this is where you can find me on the web, pamelafox.org. You can find me on Mastodon, and you can still kind of find me on Twitter. We don't really know what's going to happen there. But I have actually been, I was preparing for this talk and thinking back on this, and I've been deploying web apps for a fairly long time. So I started in high school using PHP, MySQL, like everyone back then. This is like the 90s, right? And I was deploying it to like some, server in Florida, I think. And back then I would often use, FTP. So I don't even know if that really counts as deploying, but that's about where I started. Then I went to Google to work there in developer relations. And I was at Google when they came out with Google App Engine. And I thought it was really exciting because it was just this very easy way to get started. And you could make a Python app on App Engine so quickly. So I made about 150 Python demo apps then. They actually had increased the quota just for me. Then I went to Coursera as one of the first engineers there. And back then Coursera was written in Python plus Django. So I, got to work a lot on that, and that we deployed to AWS EC2. I remember once when we did a deploy and we realized there was something wrong and we didn't have a great deploy process at that point. So we manually went into each of the EC2 instances and manually fixed the JavaScript in it. That was just a bad thing. So after that, we improved our deploy processes. I then went to Khan Academy, where I both created content and also engineered. And that was a Flask website at the time on Google App Engine. Then Woebot, where I was CTO, and we deployed to AWS. And now I'm at Microsoft, where I'm a Python cloud advocate, where my job is to help Python developers try to get up and running on Azure. So I pretty much spend all day trying to deploy stuff to Azure and figuring out what works and what doesn't. So that's why I'm sharing this today. So I guess I've been playing a long time, and I really like it. I had an ex once, I think when I was at Coursera, that he thought, I deployed so much. When he was setting up our Wi-Fi network, he called it "Don't Stop Deploying," and then he set the password to "I like to ship it." And this was all poking fun at the fact that I guess I deploy a lot. So that's me. I do have a survey to see where all of you are from in terms of your deploy experience. I realized that while I'm presenting, I think I'm actually 30 seconds ahead of the actual stream. So we'll see if I'm able to get results. But if you're able to fill out that survey, it would be fun to see where people are deploying. I think so far that's just me. So, I think generally the top three clouds right now are Google, Amazon, and Azure. But, for Python developers, that could be very different because we've also got options like Python Anywhere. Heroku was a big option for a long time, but now the free tier isn't as good. And then, there's traditional options too. Oh, look, we've got some filled outs already. All right. So Azure is actually leading ahead right now. Small numbers, but cool. All right, I'll keep revisiting that throughout the talk to see if we get more responses. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about my deployment journey on Azure. And I've only been at Azure since May. And so I joined at the end of May. 5 days later, I had a baby. And so I went on maternity leave. But babies in the beginning, they sleep a lot. So I was quite bored while the baby was sleeping on me. And so what did I do? I started deploying stuff on Azure because I wanted to learn how it works. And it's kind of a good thing to do while the baby's sleeping on you, because you're just like, oh, I'll just deploy and just watch the baby, whatever. So all these first deploys happened in the first few weeks of my baby's life when they were sleeping a lot. So the first thing I tried to deploy was an Azure function. And I went through this tutorial about creating a function in Azure with Python using VS Code. And so this was actually creating the project entirely in VS Code using the Azure Tools extension and using all the rest of the Azure extensions. And so it's pretty neat. You can actually just do everything inside VS Code. You can log into the Azure account. You can create a new function project. It'll bootstrap all the code for you. You can then test that function locally. You can deploy that function. So you can do it all inside VS Code. So that was my first experience with deploying anything on Azure. And what it actually deployed, so you click the button in VS Code and it does all this for you. So it doesn't just deploy a function, it deploys an app service plan, a storage account to store the function code, and then application insights for monitoring. So this is the first thing I learned about deploying stuff onto Azure, which is probably true of other clouds as well, is that you're not just deploying to a single service. A lot of times you're deploying to multiple services that are working together. Right? And you can mix and match these services in a lot of ways. So we'll see a lot of mixing and matching as we keep going. But this was surprising to me because I had come from Google App Engine, the original App Engine, where everything was combined together. So you would deploy the App Engine and that had your database, it had it memcache, it had everything there. So that's what I was used to. But in the even in the new App Engine and in Azure, it's instead you're deploying to multiple resources and figuring out what makes sense for your solution and connecting those together. So the next thing that I deployed was an app service web app with a Postgres database backend. So there I used an Azure portal template. So that's something you can search the marketplace for these templates, and I found it in this tutorial. So I use this template where I'd fill out all this information and then it would automatically create the resources for me. And then I set up a GitHub workflow using the deployment tab. And that way, whenever I pushed to the GitHub, it would deploy that new code. So that was interesting. That was a very different way of doing it. And that deployed, actually, that created quite a few resources. So we've got the app service app and the Postgres database, but we also have a virtual network and a private DNS zone, so that that's a much more secure way of communicating with the Postgres server, so that you don't have to worry about people hacking into your server. And then it also deployed a lot more on the analytics side. So it's interesting to see how much could be created by just, using this portal template that took care of it. So that was pretty cool because that created quite a few resources that were fairly, powerful. And then for my third deploy, I deployed to Azure Container Apps. So Azure Container Apps, it's like Kubernetes, but with a layer of abstraction on top, because I don't actually know Kubernetes yet. But it's nice because it is billed, per usage versus per hour. So I deployed to Azure Container Apps with a CDN on top. If you saw Michael's talk earlier, CDNs are great. I like to always put a CDN on top to save me money and help users out. So for this one, I used a combination of Azure CLI commands, as well as using the portal UI for anything that I didn't figure out in the CLI. So you can see a bunch of commands there, and I then wrote a blog post with all those commands to help me remember, right? So that was interesting. So you can do a lot with the Azure CLI. And that created all these resources. So we've got a container app, a container registry to store the image. Then we've got the front door, the CDN profile, the CDN endpoint, and then a key vault for storing secrets, and then our log analytics. Okay, so those are 3 different ways of deploying to Azure. As it turns out, I actually don't like any of those ways. Because what happened is, okay, so I did all those deploys in the first few weeks while my, newborn is still in a newborn stupor, right? And then she wakes up. And so then I get distracted taking care of her for the next 3 months. And then I come back to actual work. And I want to update those apps that I made, in those first few weeks. And I just can't remember how to update them because I use so many different ways of doing it. So like with Viz Code, and yeah, I pronounce it Viz Code. Don't quote me. I don't know if that's the official way to pronounce it. It sounds right to me. So with Viz Code, I just couldn't remember what to click in the extension. Like, how did I deploy it again? And I'm always bad with icons and remembering what icon does what. So I didn't like that because I couldn't remember what to click. The portal, the UI changes, and then I couldn't remember how I actually deployed the code. Like, did I set up a GitHub workflow or did I FTP? You can actually FTP. I couldn't remember. All of this is about me not remembering. So part of it is like, I should write stuff down. And then the Azure CLI, I couldn't remember, like, did I exactly run those commands? Did I copy them down right? And now to redeploy, what do I have to do, right? What do I need to change? So all these different ways of deploying, and I just found it frustrating because when I came back to these apps, I couldn't figure out how to redeploy. So I was sad, but I discovered something better. So what I discovered is infrastructure as code. And specifically, I discovered Azure Bicep, which is Azure's specific infrastructure as code language. And I've basically been addicted ever since. Like, everyone on my team, I think, thinks of me as the Bicep fangirl. So Bicep is an infrastructure as code language similar to Terraform. And I mentioned Terraform because I think it's the most popular. It's, it's open source and you can use it for quite a few clouds. But this one is specific to Azure, so that's why I use it. And Bicep can declaratively define Azure cloud resources. So you describe what it is that you want to create, and then you can use tools in order to actually have Azure create those resources. So I really like this because I can just look at it and know, oh yeah, that is what I'm making. I'm making a Python 3.10 app service, and it's got, these environment variables. I'm making a Postgres server and it's version 14, and, and this is the storage size and all that stuff. So I've got it. I can look at it, I can reason about it, and I can repeatedly deploy with it. Oh, and I have another survey. Let's see if we can get to, and we can check back on our earlier survey, see if we got more responses. And this one is not behind a CDN. I guess we'll find out whether I should put it behind a CDN. No. Oh, look at that. So even with VPS Azure and AWS. Very interesting. These are, of course, small numbers. But here the question is, what have you used? Have you used infrastructure as code? You can comment in the survey, you can comment on Slack. I'm just really curious to see how many other developers out there are using infrastructure as code. So I filled it out so far because all I've used is Bicep. I do want to try out Terraform because you can use Terraform to deploy Azure resources. I just haven't had the time yet. Yeah, we'll have a survey about how to pronounce Viz Code later. So, all right, so Bicep. So yeah, I don't know how many people actually write Bicep. The good news is you don't necessarily need to write Bicep yourself. You could use existing Bicep files. You could use tools to generate Bicep. So one that is nice is noobsgen.com. This is an open source project started by my colleagues. And, basically you decide, do you want Terraform? Do you want Bicep? What region do you want to be in? Are you deploying a Python app? What SKU do you want? Free or basic? What kind of database do you want? What SKU do you want for the database? Do you want to add anything extra like Redis or MongoDB? And then we can download the configuration files. And we get the zip file. You can expand, okay? And here, what you see is that we get all these Bicep files. So we have a main.bicep, and then it refers to an app service.bicep and a PostgreSQL.bicep, which has the additional information in it. We'll just open those up. So that's these are what we call Bicep modules. So it's very common to have, a main module that passes in configuration into additional modules. And so that's all taken care of for you. So that's one way that you could just generate the Bicep for you and not have to write it yourself, because I've heard from a lot of people that they don't like writing infrastructure as code. Let's see if we have some responses here. So according to our very large survey here, half of you have not used infrastructure as code. A few people have used Terraform. Just me has used Bicep, and one person has used Helm charts. So most people do not write infrastructure as code. But the point I want to get across is that it is possible to, reuse other people's Bicep files and be able to use them for your own infrastructure. Okay, so once you have a bunch of Bicep files or one Bicep file, how do you actually use that to create those resources? So here is a recording where I did it using the Azure CLI. So I do a AZ deployment sub create, and I specify the template file. So I just specified main.bicep. I specified the location it's going to create it. And that goes ahead and chugs along for a while. So 3 minutes. Yeah, so it took 3 minutes to create the app service app, the Postgres. Let's see what it made. App service plan, app service, container. Oh, this one had a container registry and a Postgres server. So that took about 3 minutes. And then it outputs this JSON that shows the result of the creation. So that's one way that you could take a Bicep file and use it to create your resources. So the thing that's cool is that if you change something about the Bicep file, you could rerun this same command, and it will only recreate whatever doesn't exist yet. So it only recreate resources that don't exist yet, and it only reconfigure things that have changed. So it actually does some amount of diffing to figure out what actually needs to be redone. So subsequent times can actually be much faster, right? The very first time you create a bunch of resources, that can be slow because it's actually creating these accounts for you in the cloud. But subsequent times, if nothing much has changed, it's going to be fairly fast. So I want to sell you, because I'm now an infrastructure as code advocate. I want to convince you that there's a lot of great reasons to use infrastructure as code. So the languages like Bicep, they're not just JSON. They kind of look like JSON, when you look at parts of it, or like a Python dict. But they've got other things. They've got parameters. They've got variables. They've got conditional logic. They've got loops. All of those things are a part of these languages. And so that means you can actually make your Bicep files fairly sophisticated and make them more reusable, more flexible. So that's something that's nice, is that it's not just a key value description. It's actually is a language. The cool thing is that when compare this to using a CLI, the creation of resources can be parallelized. So what happens is that Azure looks at the resources, looks at the dependencies, because it can figure out the dependencies in the Bicep file. It can see that something is dependent on the output of something else. And you can even add a depends on if it doesn't realize that. So it looks at the dependencies and comes up with this dependency chart, and then it'll actually parallelize everything possible. So if there are some things that can be created all at once together, it can create all those things together. So then you can have much faster provisioning processes. So that's really good in terms of speed, right? If you need to be able to get something up quickly. Another thing that's nice about using Bicep is that you can track it with version control, so you can see when configuration changed. So I recently went through and upgraded a bunch of things to Python 3.10 and also other things to Python 3.11, depending on what we were doing. So you can see in the Bicep file, we can just see the moment where it changes from 3.9 to 3.10, right? So being able to track your configuration is really nice. You can lint the Bicep files for validity. So just like I'm sure you're all linting your Python code, you can lint those Bicep files and it'll check to look for issues. You really do want to always lint your files, because a lot of times there is issues. So, lint your files first before you spend the effort on and time on provisioning. And that's how you can do it just with this command here. And then even more excitingly, you could lint for security issues. So this is something we just started doing in the last few weeks because we discovered this GitHub action from Microsoft. So my colleague Anthony Shaw has been using this. And so you can run this action on the templates and it can look at your configuration and it can point out security issues. It can say like, oh, your firewall is way too permissive, like, or, oh, you should be using managed identity. You should be using a virtual net. You shouldn't have public access, for your blobs. It will point out all of those issues. And then you can even have them uploaded to the security tab of your GitHub repo and, decide which of them. Some of them you might not act on, right? Not everything in the world is perfectly secure, but it's good to know, right? And so that's something it can analyze purely based on the Bicep, what security issues it thinks you might have. So that's really exciting. All right. So, hopefully that makes it sound like Bicep is compelling. There's still a big question mark as, should web app developers really be learning to write infrastructure as code? I've talked to multiple people who feel like that's, that they don't think of themselves as a DevOps person, therefore they shouldn't be writing Bicep. So that's fair. Like, I like writing Bicep. It's kind of like how, we write SQL, we write HTML. Those are all declarative languages. Bicep is another declarative language. But maybe not everyone should be expected to learn. So I am curious, just for your thoughts in the chat, whether you see, a world where web app developers do learn to write infrastructure as code, or if you, think that should be left to DevOps folks. But if you are going to write it, I do have some tips for you, especially if you're going to write Bicep. So install the Bicep extension for VS Code, because it will point out issues. So it'll kind of lint on demand, right? So it'll point out all the syntax issues with your Bicep. It also has snippets and autocomplete and all that stuff. Use the Bicep reference. So this is the reference for all the resources. So you can look at a particular look for a particular resource like API management. You can see all the possible properties it takes and what the values can be. So keep that open or just search for it. Search GitHub for examples. I love GitHub code search. So much of my life is better because of GitHub code search. So what I do is I go to GitHub and, I'm looking for an example of somebody, let's say I'm looking for an example of somebody who's used this. Then I go and, put that string in there. And then I go and I say, I can say lang Bicep. That'll search for everything with the language of Bicep. And here we look at the code. So I can find all these examples of other people have used that service, that resource in their Bicep. So I do this quite a lot when I'm looking for obscure parameter usages. I just like to see, other examples. I'm very much somebody who learns from other examples. And then another thing you can do is you can actually create the Azure resource in the Azure portal, and then you can export the ARM JSON for it. So there's something called ARM, which is a JSON format, which is similar to Bicep, but way more verbose. But when you are in the portal, you can export out the ARM, and then you can decompile the ARM into Bicep. This is my last resort because that JSON contains every possible configuration. It doesn't contain the minimal configuration. It's every possible thing, that could be specified about this thing. So I only do that when I'm really desperate. Otherwise, you'll have an overly verbose configuration. Because what you want the minimal thing, right? You only want to override the things that aren't default. So you don't want to have to specify every little thing. You only want to specify the things that are different. And I have a blog post here with more tips for writing Bicep files for those of you who are going down that route. Okay, but this so far, all I've shown is how to provision. So provision, this is a word I didn't really know before this year. Provision is creating the resources inside the Azure account. So provisioning a server, provisioning a web app. But what we haven't done yet is we haven't actually deployed code to whichever resource is hosting that, right? So we could provision the app service, but we also need to deploy code to the app service. And same thing with Azure Functions, Azure Container Apps, etc. So how do we actually deploy the code? Lots of people will use like GitHub integrations or CLI or even portal uploads, but there's a better way, and it just came out very recently, and I'm really excited about it. So the better way is currently called the Azure Developer CLI, or AZD is the command. It's going to get renamed, so don't get too attached to the name. And I don't know what the new name is. It's in preview mode right now, and it should be hopefully generally out of preview mode soon. But I am such a big fan of it, and I just use it all the time now. So this is a new CLI tool that's designed to help with all steps of the dev cycle. So we've got the provision step, AZD provision, the deploy step, AZD deploy. We've got AZD up, which does both of them. So that's all I use. We've got CI/CD. If you want to set up a GitHub workflow, you just do that with AZD pipeline config. And then we've got monitoring, which will pop up in the dashboard. So this is hopefully covering a lot of steps of the cycle and trying to make it really straightforward to do so. So let's look at AZD up. Okay, this is the one that I use the most often because this does everything. It actually does AZD init first, which initializes an environment, right? So, I'm inside a project. So I say what the name of this is going to be. That becomes the prefix for all the resources that get made. I pick my subscription. I pick my Azure location. So that's, I've initialized all the parameters it needs in order to create this, this project. And then it starts to provision the resources. So you can see here, it says I can view the progress. You can see as it's deploying. And first it starts with a resource group. A resource group is a container for everything else. Then it creates everything else. That was pretty fast. So this was probably a second provision because that was really fast. So you see it created a virtual network and a workspace, an app service plan, an app service. I think it's still working on making a server here. And luckily this is pre-recorded, so I can just, oh, sorry, this went way too far. Wait, I got lost. Okay, sorry. So this, I try to use I can't pronounce this, ASCII-NUMA. So ASCII-NUMA is something that, records your screen. But it's a little weird when you put it in the slides. Okay, I just want to go forward. All right, I fast forwarded, and what you can see what happened is it provisioned everything, and then the next step is AZD deploy. So where it actually takes the code, bundles it up, and sends it to the Azure App Service, and then you can actually go and visit that in the browser. Let's see if this website is still running. That was from a deploy a few days ago. So here you can see the Django website is running. So that's AZD up. So that's what I use all the time because it does provisions, it does deploys, and it just does everything. And if something didn't change, then it doesn't have to do a lot of work. If all you did is change the code, if all you did was change your app code, then you can just run AZD deploy. So here I have an example of that. So if I just do AZD deploy, it's not going to look at the Bicep files at all. It's going to assume that you don't want to change anything about that. And it's just going to work on bundling up your code and sending that to the relevant host, right? So fast forward, and there we go. It has deployed. So that's something you can use for a fast deploy of just the code. A lot of times I'm changing both infra and code, but I think for most developers, you would only be changing the code. And then we have AZD pipeline config. So this is a command that sets up all the secrets needed for the pipeline, right? So you can have this pipeline that every time you push the code, it will then deploy the code. And this is what the pipeline looks like here. And so the pipeline does need a bunch of secrets, right? And it's going to get these from your GitHub secrets. So, we go to, actually, I'm not on, I don't have the secrets tab for this repo. It's not my repo. But yeah, so you see it gets the secrets and then it logs in with the secrets. It does provision and then it does deploy. And so you can run AZD pipeline config, and what that does, it just sets up the secrets, right? So it sets those secrets and then does a little push up to Git. GitHub so that it knows about the secrets. And then going forward, every time you push, it'll run this. And here I have it only set on push to main because I don't want to deploy when I'm in pull request. So it's up to you whether you think it's a good idea to be deploying on push to main. I think it's arguable what the best strategy there is as to when you deploy. At Khan Academy, we would deploy before pushing the main because, right, we would deploy, we would do all of our checks to make sure, nothing horrible happened. And then only an hour afterwards would we feel comfortable pulling into main, right? So there's lots of different strategies for when you actually push out a website. But if you did want to push, have it deploy every time you push to main, you could use this workflow and then it would do it for you. So that's cool. So how do you make a project that works with AZD? So the first thing is just having those Bicep files. So the same kind of files that I generated from NoobsGen with that main.bicep, you want to have those files in Bicep. So you can put those usually in an Infra folder, right? So we can take a look at this Infra folder here. This is for the Django Postgres app. So I have this main.bicep. And I also have this resources.bicep. It's just how I organize the code. But you can see in this file, I've got the setup for the VNet, the private DNS zone, the actual app, service app, and you can see it's in Python 3.10, and then some analytics, and then the Postgres server. So this defines everything that needs to be created. And then we have Azure.yaml, which tells it what to deploy. So we tell it that it's actually going to deploy the root of the folder, and it's a Python project, and it's deploying to the app service app. And you can deploy multiple things. So this defines this service to deploy, and it cross-references with the Bicep. So you see this is called web. Well, so it looks inside the resources to find which is tagged with web. So you see here, it says AZD service name web. So it now knows, AZD knows that this app service is where you want to deploy this code here. So that's the link between Azure.yaml and the Bicep files is this name of the service here and using a tag to name it here. So that way it knows what to deploy where. So that's Azure.yaml. There's also, I usually like to add the workflows for deploying. So that's in my workflow file. So I've got Azure Dev.yaml separate from my Python, linting and testing YAML. And then I often like to have also just some nice setup things for the environment. So I typically will have a VS Code folder for VS Code settings. And then more importantly, I love dev containers. So I always have a dev container folder, which has all the definitions for the dev container. So if like this is the Postgres app, this means that you can open this up in a dev container and it'll actually start Postgres locally inside that container, inside that Docker, using Docker Compose. So I love this because I hate setting up Postgres locally. And so this sets it up for me. It also means I can just develop in GitHub code spaces, and I'll have a Postgres database there as well. So all of my AZD templates have dev container support because I think it just makes it so much easier to work on things. But those are bonus. You don't need those for deploying. For deploying, you need some Bicep, you need Azure.yaml, and that's it, right? So if you do want to make a project compatible with AZD, there's a tutorial here that talks about how to do it. But once again, you may not want to do all that work. Totally makes sense, right? My job is to do the work, right? Because it's a lot to figure out how to write Bicep and use a new tool and all that stuff. So what we're trying to do on our team is make AZD templates for the many popular configurations that people might want to deploy as Python developers. So I made this table here to show the various templates we've made. So the top frameworks we have are Flask, Fast API, and Django. And the top, I guess, most popular hosting places would be app service, functions, and container apps. There's also a few other ones like Kubernetes service, but I think these are our 3 most popular for Python web developers to deploy to. So you can see like if you want to deploy a simple Flask app on app service, you could start with this example here. If you wanted to add in Postgres, then we've got examples that add in Postgres. And the same thing with Fast API, you know, we've got simple examples. We've got ones that add on a CDN. We've got ones that add on MongoDB using Cosmos. And then for Django, we pretty much always are going to have a Postgres with Django. So there we have a lot of examples for app service. I haven't actually done an example for functions because it doesn't feel like the best fit for functions, but you know, maybe a Django REST example would be good there. So if you have ideas for that, you know, let me know. And container apps, it could also be a good fit. I just haven't made that one yet. So, you know, find the example that is most similar to what you want to do and copy, right? You know, copy those infra files, look at how the configuration is done. And generally finding the similar architecture is more important than finding the same framework, right? Like just this, yesterday, I made a Fast API container app example, and I just did it by using my Flask API container example, and the infra files didn't have to change. So a lot of times the infrastructure files are actually really similar across languages and frameworks. Sometimes there's these maybe little subtle differences, or the configuration, the environment variables are a little different. But generally it's the infrastructure that matters more than what particular framework you're using. So hopefully there's an example here that is similar to what you're trying to do. If there isn't, do let me know, tweet at me, whatever, Slack at me, whatever. And it may be something we can build a new template for, because if you want to do it, maybe somebody else does too. There's also more AZD templates out there. There's an AZD templates gallery. You can search GitHub for the AZD templates tag. And yeah, hopefully we're going to build up more, because it needs to be easier to deploy, right? And to deploy, more complex setups. And we don't want people to have to spend a lot of time figuring that out. It should be easy. So just to finish up, I have just want to show some of the examples that I have from that previous slide. So one example here is Fast API deployed to an Azure function with a CDN on top. And this is a static maps API. Let's see if this is, I think it's still running. Yeah. So here we have the docs for Fast API, and you can see this is behind the Azure CDN. So I have different cache rules for the docs versus the output images. For the docs, I think I only cache that on the CDN for 5 minutes. For the images, I cache them for a long time, like I think 7 days or something like that, because maps generally don't change too often, especially not the ones I'm generating. So that's something when you have a CDN, you do want to figure out the appropriate cache rules for different types of resources. So here we can try it out, and let's execute. And here we go. That is a picture of New York. Let me get a picture more. So let's see, 37. I don't know if I have my latitude, longitude. I used to have it memorized when I worked at Google Maps. Is this even? There's the ocean. Oh, let's try this one. There's more ocean. I don't even know if this is valid. Let's do Mountain View, latitude, longitude. I should have it accept an address. That would be better. 37 -122. Okay, I was close. 37 -122. There we go. We got Santa Cruz. It's actually where my mom lives. Yeah, so that's the Maps API, and you can see the code in here. So if you're ever curious how I did it, you can look and see at the CDN, look at that endpoint. You can see the cache rules here. So you can see the default of 5, and then I have additional cache rules for the images. And that's pretty interesting. Let's look at another one. So this one is deploying a Flask app using the API Flask framework, which is similar to Fast API. And this deploys it to Azure Container Apps and then with the CDN on top. So similar, except, with using a container and generates bar charts. So I could use this in my survey app if I wanted to generate bar charts of the results here. And this is using Matplotlib behind the scenes. So this one, it looks kind of similar, but it's actually a fairly different set of resources, because what you have to do is you actually have to create the Docker image and upload it to the registry. And AZD does that for you as long as everything's set up correctly. So you can look through the info files there to see how that's done. And then finally, I wanted to show this example I've been working on lately. There's this cookie cutter Django project, which is really cool. And I wanted to see if I could deploy that to Azure, because it's actually a pretty interesting, setup that should be fairly real world for a lot of you. So it's got, an app and it's got a database, but it also uses Redis for caching and for Celery. So you can use Redis for both of those. And there was just a Celery talk before me. And then it also uses a storage account with different buckets for media uploads versus static uploads. And they actually have different rules in them. Let me see if I can bring up the storage account rules. Right, so you can see the static one has public access blob, because we're pretty okay with people being able to access the CSS and JavaScript, but the media one doesn't have that public access blob, and instead this uses the Django storages library to generate these SAS tokens, which have a certain amount of expiration on them, which is a little more secure than just having something public. And so you can see also here the cache, and you can see the configuration of the app here with all the environment variables that then become Django settings. So we've got, the Postgres URL, the Redis URL. And so this is actually getting it from our infrastructure, the storage account information, a SendGrid API key. SendGrid is not part of Microsoft, but very popular for email. So I store that API key in the Key Vault, which is a Microsoft Key Vault for secret storage, and then a post build command because I'm using Gulp or Webpack in order to actually build the resources. So this will build them as part of the deploy. So I thought there's some interesting stuff here that I wanted to point out. All right, so that is what I wanted to show. Hopefully you are intrigued about infrastructure as code, for whatever platform that you're developing with. And if you do have any questions or needs about the examples I showed in particular, or Azure stuff, then please let me know. I will be in the face-to-face, and I'm also just generally on the internet. And we can just also talk about pronunciation in our face-to-face too.